What I want to talk about today is going to go from history to practice. I was very educated and took a lot of interest in the worship of how Methodists worshiped. But to put all the liturgies up gets kind of boring. So I really want to talk about where we started, where we are now, and where we should be going. Because the challenges have always been before us in Christendom, how we worship and how we are effective in doing that. But I think we live, as the Chinese curse says, in interesting times, and I want to address some of those issues. The first official publication of how Methodists worship happened in 1784. John Wesley wrote the Sunday service of the Methodists in North America. This was presented at the Christmas conference in 1784 in Baltimore. John Wesley was in his 80s when he did this. This was toward the end of his life. He had this preface that was in the book. He very much believed that there was no more beautiful liturgy than that was present in the Anglican Church in the Book of Common Prayer. He made very little alterations to the Anglican liturgy except in a few areas. He did away with some of the holy days of the Christian year. He considerably shortened the service. The reason he shortened the service is because he wanted a weekly celebration of the Eucharist to happen every Sunday. This was borderline scandalous in Anglican Church at the time, when they would be lucky if they celebrated it 3 times a year. So Wesley was ahead of the curve. And he left a lot of the Psalms out because he wanted people to get immersed in the Word. He just didn't want to get them depressed. And if you look at a lot of the Psalms of lament, you realize that they're not always as uplifting. They're very honest prayers, but they're not always as uplifting. And if you don't believe that, read the 137th Psalm and get back with me. The highlights of the service, again, very similar to the Book of Common Prayer. He was very intentional not to mention any nationalistic observances because he knew that America was in flux where its government was concerned. They didn't know if they were going to have a president, king, emperor, what have you. The book was intended for itinerant preachers rather than established parishes. Why? Because there were no established parishes. He wanted something he could give the preacher to put in the saddlebag of his horse, basically. It was shipped to North America unbound, and it was bound in New York. Anybody know the reason for that? Taxes. If you ship something bound across the pond, it was going to have an increased usury tax. And so it was shipped unbound, and it was bound in New York. And it was formally adopted. They had resolution, and those of you who've been to annual conference know how that works. But it was formally adopted at the Christmas conference in Baltimore in 1784. It was a very prime source of Wesley's liturgical theology in 3 ways. He believed what is said and done in worship is a reflection of our belief. He believed that all worship would examine our evidence of faith, and that it would attempt to express our faith more adequately. The basic pattern of worship was Anglican in nature. By the way, John Wesley died an Anglican priest. He was basically born an Anglican priest because he and his brother basically inherited the faith and lived in a parsonage or rectory all their lives. And the scriptures were in abundance in this book. Morning prayer, service of worship, evening prayer, immersed in Old Testament, epistle, gospel, and psalmody. So nobody can say that Methodists were unscriptural because Wesley thought we should be immersed in it. It was a service book as opposed to a prayer book. It was not like the Book of Common Prayer. It was more specific about how services should be conducted in worship. The reason I did not wear my collar and suit today was to illustrate the point. Wesley made no references whatsoever to clerical garb or vestments, removed any references to service music or choral arrangement. Wesley didn't think they belonged in worship. He thought they belonged more in other venues. He thought congregational singing was adequate, and basically the congregation served as a choir whenever people worshiped together. Again, shorten the service so that weekly celebration of the Eucharist could take place. modernized some of the language. Any of you read Elizabethan English realize that it is very stilted, and even in Wesley's day it started to become difficult to use and understand. Private baptisms were disallowed. He believed that baptism was done in the presence and witness of God's people, and that they had a responsibility, as well as the one being baptized, to respond to and live in Christian community. And as soon as it got across the pond, Coke and Asbury ditched it. It was unbound, and nobody fessed up to it. Historians think Thomas Coke was the one who did it. He took some pages out. He also inserted some stuff in. And Wesley heard about it, and he shook his head, so he did an errata and sent it across, and it got dismissed too. Basically, what I think happened was Asbury and Coke looked at it and said, you know what, the old geezer's 80 years old. And thank God he's not here bothering us anymore. We can finally get something done. So, the 1784 service, you can find copies of it online. If you'd like a copy of it, I can get you a copy of it. But it basically wasn't used at all. Fast forward to Yes, Greg.
In the 1784 book, service book, the book where the phrase from the Apostles' Creed, descended into the dead, was eliminated.
Yes.
That's where it comes from. That's why we Methodists don't say it in the rest of the...
We didn't want to say that sweet Jesus possibly could have gone to hell or to the dead or anything. So, yes, Greg is correct. That was an editorial. Nobody fessed up to, but yes. Fast forward to 1989, the hymnal that we have now, which we call a new hymnal. The new hymnal is 20 years old, by the way. It was approved, included in it was the basic pattern of worship: 1, entrance and gathering; 2, proclamation and response; 3, thanksgiving and communion; and 4, sending forth. Also, no mention of vestments or clerical garb takes place in either the book of worship or the hymnal. It is not seen as prescriptive. The only service that you have to use in the United Methodist Church is the ordinal, which is for the ordination of deacons and elders, as well as the consecration of bishops. Communion liturgy that we have now was modeled on the liturgy of Justin Martyr, which was somewhere around the 160s, in the Eucharistic prayer of Hippolytus of Rome. What we have when we do this in worship is basically we're going back at 1900 years and basically celebrating communion the same way it was done as the earliest recordings have it. Baptismal rites reintroduced the Apostles' Creed in interrogative form. The history of that was the Apostles' Creed was developed as a response to church heresy, specifically Gnosticism. Anybody who could answer the Apostles' Creed in interrogative could not be a Gnostic, because it claimed Jesus not only is divine but also human, claimed God as creator, that the world was good, and that the Holy Spirit was a reality, as well as the church established on earth. A Gnostic could not affirm those things. So before one was baptized, they were asked, do you believe in God the Father? The response was, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. Also, services of morning and evening prayer were included in the hymnal. They're in the back. It doesn't offend me. When my sermon gets bad, I tell people, get your hymnal out, look at the morning and evening prayer. There's all kinds of neat stuff in there. So there's plenty to do in worship if my sermon is really kind of crummy. So what I've given you is what happened in 1784, what we have in 1989. I could have taken the rites and rituals of the Methodist Episcopal Church and show you how they formulated together. It's really neat. We could get together and do that, take a couple, 3 hours. But I think what's really important is, what do we do with all this? What was Wesley's intention? What would his vision be for us now? And more importantly, how would God have us worship in this place, in this time, in human history? Well, when we talk about contemporary worship, I'm not talking about getting a bunch of guitars out, all the preachers ditching their vestments and rearranging the sanctuary furniture. Contemporary worship, contemporary means today. What do we do today? And what do we do for the future? One, and this is the hardest for preachers to swallow, we no longer live in a lecture-based society. If you don't believe that, go to school. Go to college. Lectures are a thing of the past. We have a shorter attention span. We also have the ability to multitask. And when I say we, collectively, Sky McCracken cannot do that. It's not because I'm male, it's just the way I was raised. When I went to the library to study, I had to have my own Carol, leave me the heck alone. I'm going to work on this one thing. When I'm on my computer, I can work on one thing. My daughter can chat, watch a video, type her paper, have a window open to do research, all while she's listening to her iPod and texting on her phone. And you know what's really interesting about that? She can do it fairly effectively. I can't do that. But just because I can't do that doesn't mean, as a leader of worship, that I don't have to find other ways to creatively proclaim the gospel. We had plans for a new United Methodist hymnal to be done. I was real excited about it. A fellow member of the Order of St. Luke, Heather Jocelyn, I can't remember her, she's one of those got a weird hyphenated last name like me. I was excited about her being on it because Heather's really sharp, and you know what happened? They canned it. Not just because they couldn't afford it, but because somebody said, who's going to buy another hymnal? We don't use hymnals anymore. Do we? Well, some of us do.
Scott, I got a message from Taylor Burton Edwards that said that they were gathering resources for contemporary worship that will be presented digitally.
Yeah.
For churches to download, and that
Digital's the way to go. For one, it's cheaper, it's more effective, you can get the word out a lot quicker, and if there's a errata, you can correct it quickly. You can insert a page, you can take out a page very, very, very quickly. But we're not going to have another United Methodist hymnal. That's just not going to happen. We no longer live in a society governed by the basic principles of Judeo-Christian ethics. So we can't make assumptions we used to make. If somebody comes into our church, if they came in our church 50 years ago and we said the Lord's Prayer, they could probably say it. For those who grew up in liturgical Protestant or Roman Catholic, Episcopalian backgrounds, if you did the Apostles' or the Nicene Creed, people could say it. You cannot assume those things anymore. I learned that stuff when I was in Vacation Bible School. When I was a kid, I went through confirmation classes. There are people my age, I'm 44, and that gets younger every day, that were not raised in the church, do not have this culture, do not have this history. So what do? We have to teach and model it and not assume anything from somebody who comes in the doors of our church. The seminary background in me bristles like a cat's back when I say this, but we have to market the message, like it or not. Do we do evangelism in worship now? Absolutely. In fact, it may be our number one place to do evangelism. In Wesley's day, that was not the case, but it is the case now. Worship is the front door for evangelism.